The rain hammered against the cracked windows of the abandoned warehouse like nature's own percussion symphony, each drop a desperate plea for attention. Marcus Thompson stood alone in the cavernous space, his weathered hands trembling as he stared at his phone's dying battery. The storm outside had transformed from a gentle drizzle into a torrential nightmare, flooding the streets and cutting off all escape routes. His construction crew had evacuated hours ago, leaving him stranded with a critical deadline looming. In his panic, his thumb had moved too quickly across the emergency contacts, selecting Margaret instead of Mike. He didn't realize his mistake until it was too late. Now, through the industrial-sized windows streaked with rain, headlights pierced the darkness, moving steadily toward him through the flooded street. Someone was actually coming. But who? Marcus Thompson, 42 years old with calloused hands and graying temples, had built his life around solitude and self-reliance. His construction company, Thompson & Sons, though he had no sons, operated out of a modest office downtown. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd named it optimistically during his brief marriage 15 years ago. Now, standing in his steel-toed boots and paint-stained flannel shirt, he represented everything blue-collar and unpretentious. His apartment was a studio filled with technical manuals, instant coffee, and photographs of completed building projects instead of family. Uncle Marcus? His nephew Danny's voice echoed in his memory from their phone call earlier that morning. Are you ever lonely? The 12-year-old's innocent question had caught him off guard during their weekly breakfast at Mel's Diner. Marcus had deflected with jokes about having all the quiet he needed, but the boy's concern lingered like construction dust in his lungs. Now, trapped by the storm with water rising around the warehouse foundation, that conversation felt prophetic. The emergency had forced him to reach out, something he rarely did, and his clumsy fingers had betrayed him in the most unexpected way. The text message had been simple: stranded at Riverside Warehouse District. Storm flooding. Need help. But Margaret Sinclair, his ex-wife's wealthy stepmother, had received it instead of Mike, his foreman. Margaret, whom he'd met exactly 3 times during his short-lived marriage to Sarah. Twice at awkward family dinners and once at the divorce proceedings. She was everything he wasn't. Polished, connected, living in a mansion on Elm Street with more bathrooms than his entire apartment building. Marcus stared at his phone, watching the battery percentage drop to 8%. His memory drifted to those uncomfortable encounters with Margaret. She'd always been cordial but distant, clearly viewing him as Sarah's blue-collar phase. When Sarah left him for a corporate lawyer, Margaret had been notably absent from the drama, neither condemning nor supporting either side. Now, somehow, she was his accidental lifeline. The irony tasted bitter as day-old coffee. He'd spent years avoiding any connection to that part of his past, yet here he was, unknowingly reaching across that divide in his moment of vulnerability. Margaret Sinclair sat in her mahogany-paneled home office, rain pelting the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked her manicured garden. At 58, she maintained the elegant composure that came from decades of charity galas and board meetings. Her silver hair was perfectly styled even at 10 p.m., her silk blouse unwrinkled despite the late hour. The text had appeared on her phone while she reviewed quarterly reports for her foundation. She recognized the number immediately. She kept detailed contact lists, a habit from her corporate days. Marcus Thompson, Sarah's ex-husband. The quiet man who'd barely spoken during family gatherings, who'd seemed perpetually uncomfortable in her formal dining room. She remembered his gentle way with Sarah's young cousins, how he'd patiently explained construction concepts to curious children while the adults discussed stock portfolios and vacation homes. Mrs. Sinclair? Her driver, James, appeared in the doorway. The storm's getting worse. Perhaps we should prepare the Range Rover, she said quietly, already reaching for her coat. Someone needs help. She couldn't explain the certainty in her decision, only that something in the simple message spoke of genuine desperation. In her world of calculated networking and strategic relationships, authentic need was rare. This felt real. The Range Rover's headlights cut through sheets of rain as Margaret navigated the flooded industrial district. Her hands, adorned with her late husband's family ring, gripped the steering wheel tighter than she'd held anything in years. The GPS guided her through streets she'd never seen, past warehouses and manufacturing plants that existed in a completely different world from her usual routes between the country club and downtown boutiques. When she finally spotted Marcus through the warehouse window, her breath caught. He looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than she remembered. His broad shoulders were hunched against the cold, his usually confident stance replaced by something approaching defeat. She'd expected to find the gruff, self-sufficient man from her memories, but instead discovered someone unmistakably human in his need. "Margaret!" His voice carried genuine shock when she knocked on the metal door. I meant to text Mike, my foreman. I don't understand. Your phone auto-corrected to my contact," she explained, stepping into the echoing space. The warehouse smelled of sawdust and rain, industrial and honest in a way her usual environments never were. "I hope you don't mind that I came." Marcus ran his hand through his damp hair, a gesture she remembered from family dinners when he'd seemed overwhelmed by the formal conversation. "Mind? Margaret, you probably saved my life. The water's been rising, and I couldn't get anyone else." His voice trailed off, and she saw something she'd never witnessed before. Marcus without his carefully maintained emotional distance. As they spoke, a new crisis emerged. The warehouse's electrical system, compromised by the flooding, began sparking dangerously near Marcus's expensive equipment. Years of construction work had taught him to think quickly under pressure, but Margaret surprised him by immediately understanding the severity of the situation. "The main breaker," she said, pointing to a panel near the entrance. "From the foundation board meetings, I've learned about building safety protocols." Without hesitation, she waded through ankle-deep water in her designer heels, her expensive coat trailing in the murky flood, and shut off the main power. The warehouse plunged into darkness except for the Range Rover's headlights streaming through the windows. In that moment, with both of them standing in cold water, their usual social boundaries dissolved completely. Margaret's perfectly styled hair was now damp and disheveled, her silk blouse spotted with industrial grime, yet she'd never looked more genuinely beautiful to Marcus. "You just saved thousands of dollars in equipment," he said quietly, his voice carrying a respect he'd never shown her before, "and probably prevented a fire that could have spread to neighboring buildings." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with physical comfort and everything to do with being genuinely useful, genuinely needed, for the first time in years. The drive back to safety became an unexpected conversation that stretched far beyond the 20-minute journey. Margaret insisted on taking Marcus to his apartment, but when they arrived, she found herself reluctant to end the evening. They sat in her idling Range Rover outside his modest building, rain still drumming on the roof, talking with an ease that surprised them both. "I always thought you disapproved of me," Marcus admitted, his calloused hands wrapped around the coffee cup she'd produced from her emergency kit. "The construction worker who wasn't good enough for Sarah's family." Margaret turned to study his profile in the dashboard's soft glow. "I thought you saw me as just another rich woman playing at charity work. Someone who'd never done anything real or useful." Her voice carried a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "Tonight, shutting off that electrical panel, it was the first time in years I felt like I actually mattered to someone's survival." Marcus looked at her with new understanding. Behind the polished exterior and expensive clothes, he glimpsed someone as lonely as he was, just wrapped in different packaging. "You want to come up for real coffee?" he asked. "I mean, if you're not afraid of a working man's apartment." The invitation hung between them like a bridge across the class divide they'd both assumed was uncrossable. Margaret's first glimpse of Marcus's studio apartment revealed a man she'd never imagined. The space was small but meticulously organized, filled with architectural drawings, woodworking projects, and shelves lined with books about sustainable building practices and urban planning. The walls displayed photographs of his construction projects, not just buildings, but community centers, affordable housing developments, and a renovated children's hospital. "You built all of these?" she asked, studying a photograph of smiling families in front of a housing complex. Her fingers traced the frame gently, as if touching something sacred. "With my crew, yeah." Marcus moved around the small kitchen, preparing coffee with the same careful attention he brought to construction. That housing project took 3 years. Families who couldn't afford market rates finally had decent places to live. His voice carried quiet pride, not boastfulness, but genuine satisfaction in work that mattered. Margaret settled onto his second-hand couch, her designer dress a stark contrast to the worn fabric. Yet somehow she looked more at home than she had in her own mansion's formal living room. I fund housing initiatives through my foundation, but I've never actually seen the families who benefit. I write checks and attend galas, but I don't build anything real. They talked until dawn, sharing stories they'd never told anyone else. Margaret spoke about the loneliness of wealth, how people approached her for donations but rarely for genuine friendship. Marcus described the satisfaction of creating something permanent with his hands, but also the isolation of coming home to an empty apartment every night. The storm outside gradually calmed, but neither wanted the conversation to end in the weeks that followed. Their unlikely friendship developed through small, meaningful interactions that surprised everyone who knew them. Margaret began visiting Marcus's job sites, not as a wealthy donor making appearances, but as someone genuinely interested in learning about construction and community development. She traded her designer heels for practical boots and started asking detailed questions about building codes, worker safety, and project timelines. Mrs. Sinclair's been coming by every Tuesday, Marcus's foreman Mike observed with amusement. Yesterday she helped us figure out a logistics problem with the Community Center Foundation. Who knew rich ladies understood supply chain management? Marcus found himself looking forward to Margaret's visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified him. She brought homemade sandwiches for the crew, not catered lunches from expensive restaurants, but food she'd prepared herself in her kitchen, learning to cook for the first time in decades. Her genuine interest in his workers' lives, remembering their children's names and asking about their families, revealed a warmth that her social circle had never witnessed. Their Tuesday meetings expanded into weekend visits to Marcus's apartment, where Margaret discovered a passion for his woodworking projects. She proved surprisingly adept at sanding and staining, her manicured hands gradually becoming calloused from honest work. They developed a ritual of Saturday morning coffee followed by collaborative work on furniture pieces that Marcus donated to local families in need. I never thought I'd enjoy getting sawdust under my fingernails, Margaret confessed one afternoon, examining her transformed hands with wonder rather than dismay. But there's something deeply satisfying about creating something beautiful and functional that will matter to real people. Their conversations deepened beyond surface politeness into genuine intimacy. Margaret shared her fears about aging alone in her big house, surrounded by beautiful objects but lacking meaningful connections. Marcus opened up about his failed marriage, admitting that he'd never felt worthy of lasting love, always expecting rejection from anyone who truly got to know him. 6 months after the storm, Marcus invited Margaret to the dedication ceremony for the affordable housing complex she'd unknowingly helped fund through her foundation. The autumn air was crisp and golden, families gathering with excitement and gratitude for their new homes. Margaret stood beside Marcus as community leaders spoke about the project's impact, but she found herself watching his face instead of listening to the speeches. "You did this," she whispered to him as children played in the newly constructed playground. "You took my foundation's abstract donation and turned it into actual homes, actual joy for these families." Marcus turned to her, his eyes reflecting the same wonder she felt. "We did this," he corrected gently. "You're funding my construction, but more than that, Margaret, you've changed how I see myself. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm building something that extends beyond bricks and mortar." As the ceremony concluded and families explored their new homes, Marcus and Margaret found themselves alone on a bench overlooking the development. The setting sun painted everything in warm gold, and Margaret felt a courage she'd never possessed before. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I need to tell you something. These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. Not because of what we've built together professionally, but because you've helped me discover who I really am underneath all the wealth and social expectations." Marcus took her hand, his rough fingers intertwining with her smooth ones. "Margaret, I was drowning long before that storm hit the warehouse. drowning in loneliness and self-doubt. You didn't just rescue me that night. You've been rescuing me every day since. 1 year later, the transformation was complete and visible to everyone who knew them. Marcus's construction company had expanded into Thompson and Associates Community Development, with Margaret as his full partner, bringing both her business acumen and foundation connections to their shared mission of affordable housing and community building. Their wedding was held not in Margaret's mansion or an expensive venue, but in the community center they'd built together, surrounded by the families whose lives they'd touched. Margaret wore a simple dress that she could move freely in, her hands now permanently marked by honest work, her smile more genuine than any photograph from her previous social life. Who would have thought a wrong text message could change everything? Margaret's maid of honor joked during the reception, but Margaret and Marcus exchanged knowing looks. It hadn't been the wrong message at all. It had been exactly the right message, sent to exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. Their combined home, Marcus had moved into Margaret's mansion, which they'd converted partially into offices for their company and meeting spaces for community organizations, buzzed with purposeful activity. The formal dining room where Margaret had once hosted stilted dinner parties now served as a conference room where they planned housing developments with community leaders and residents. Marcus's nephew Danny, now 13, spent weekends with them, learning both construction skills and business planning. "Aunt Margaret," he said one Saturday morning as they reviewed blueprints together. "Uncle Marcus smiles all the time now. He never used to smile like that." Margaret ruffled the boy's hair, her heart full of gratitude for the family she'd found in the most unexpected place. "Sometimes the best things come from the biggest mistakes," she told him, catching Marcus's eye across the room as he worked on cost estimates for their next project. As Margaret looked back on that stormy night that had changed everything, she understood that both she and Marcus had been stranded long before the floodwaters rose. They'd been isolated by their own assumptions about class, worth, and belonging, building walls instead of bridges, choosing safety over connection. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal that the help we need isn't what we expected, and the person who can save us isn't who we would have chosen. The warehouse where they'd first truly seen each other had been renovated into a community resource center, its windows no longer cracked but clear and welcoming. Every time they passed it, Margaret and Marcus remembered that moment when artificial boundaries dissolved in rising water and genuine human need. Love, they'd learned, wasn't about finding someone from your own world. It was about building a new world together, brick by brick, choice by choice, storm by storm. The wrong number had been exactly right.